Can one word change how we read the story of David and Goliath? Let's find out.
What in the world is the author trying to do? What are they doing with the words that they choose?
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show where we ask the question, what is the author trying to do? Usually we ask that question about a part of the Bible, and today we're going to talk about the story of David and Goliath. But before we get to the David and Goliath story, we have to go back a couple of chapters. We have to look at chapter 4 and 5 and 6. Specifically, we have to go back to chapter 4 in 1 Samuel, because I think what the author is doing in that chapter is important for us to understand what's going on in chapter 17 when we meet David and Goliath. And it's all tied together with a single word, or one word in Hebrew, and that's the Hebrew word ma'aracha. It just means battle line. Well, at least in this context, it means battle line. Usually it just means a line of something. But for armies, it's a line of soldiers, right? And that word shows up a ton in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, and it shows up again in chapter 17. And those two places are kind of the only locations in the entire Old Testament where that word shows up that much, with that kind of density. And so the author is doing something with that kind of repetition. Now, we don't see that repetition usually in our English translations because translators get bored saying the same word over and over again, so we vary it up a bit. But in Hebrew, that word gets repeated a ton, and I think that repetition is meant to connect the two passages together. 1 Samuel chapter 4, and then what happens in chapters 5 and 6, alongside chapter 17, where David meets Goliath. So, what's going on in chapter 4 that's so important? Well, in chapter 4, it's the battle lines of Israel have drawn up against the battle lines of the Philistines. The Philistines are the forever enemy of Israel, at least during the times of Israel's kings. They were a seafaring people who'd come across the Mediterranean Sea, they'd landed on the western part of Israel's territories, and they'd kind of taken over the shoreline and the coastline. Their primary god was the god Dagon, and they worshipped Dagon as this kind of Poseidon-like character who governed the seas and then governed the fertility of the land. And Dagon was dressed in armor kind of like a fish, right? He wore scale mail, and he was very much evocative of things that came out of the sea. So the Philistines have drawn up their lines against the lines of Israel, and Israel worries that they're going to lose this military engagement, right? And so in order to kind of ensure that they walk away the victors and not defeated, they go back to Shiloh, which is a local city where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This is the place where Yahweh promised to put his presence so that he could be with the people of Israel on the Ark of the Covenant. So they send some messengers, they grab the Ark, they bring the Ark into the camp of Israel. The Israelites raise this enormous cheer of excitement because God is now present with them. Their warrior God has come into the battle camp. And the Philistines hear this commotion, right? They can hear the cheering, and they're very concerned because they think, oh no, the God who defeated Egypt, who broke the back of the Egyptian gods, has now come to fight us. And so the Philistines say, hey, we got to fight like we've never fought before. Otherwise, we're dead men. And that's exactly what they do. In fact, they go and they fight so hard that they send the Israelites running for the hills. They slaughter hundreds of them, and they capture the Ark of the Covenant. So in the ancient world, war between two different nations was often envisioned as war between their gods. And in this context, the battle lines of the Philistines were victorious against the battle lines of the Israelites. And in doing so, that meant that their god Dagon was victorious over the God of the Israelites, Yahweh. So the Israelites run, the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant, they haul it back to the temple of Dagon, and they put it in Dagon's temple as kind of a trophy of Dagon's victory. Well, over the next couple of days, some weird things happen. The priests of Dagon come to the temple of Dagon to offer some sacrifices and to, do their priestly duties. And they walk in the door, and there on the ground is the idol of Dagon lying on its face in front of the Ark of the Covenant. At first, I think that's just a weird coincidence, but it keeps happening. And then the final time that it happens, the very head of Dagon and his hands are severed from his body and lying on the threshold of the temple. That's all the backstory, the backdrop that we need in order to understand what the author is doing in chapter 17. Because in chapter 17, after saying nothing about battle lines for a very long time, he picks that word back up again. And in chapter 17, we have this idea that the battle lines of the Israelites are drawn up against the battle lines of the Philistines again. And instead of just them doing war, now we have this avatar of Dagon, Goliath, who is dressed like Dagon, armored in scale mail. He looks like a giant warrior. He's the avatar of their god, is challenging the battle lines of Israel. Now remember, the author sets up in chapter 4 this notion that war between nations is a war between their gods. And so when Israel fails to produce someone who will represent Yahweh, there's a heavy implication in the text that Yahweh is weak. He is impotent. He can't defend his own people. Dagon has his avatar in Goliath. Where's the one who is going to represent Yahweh? Well, that one is kind of scared and hiding in his tents. We're told that Saul, the king of Israel, who is head and shoulders taller than all of the other Israelites, is doing nothing but cowering in his tent. And it's with that kind of in the background that we meet David. David shows up, and as he comes into the camp of Israel, they raise the battle cry as they move toward the lines for the day. It's very similar to what happened in chapter 4, where the Ark of the Covenant comes into the camp of Israel and they raise a cheer. But this time, Israel is cowering in fear and not marching in the strength and confidence of having their God with them. David comes into the lines. He walks up to the battle lines. He sees these battle lines drawn. Again, we get that word repeated over and over again, battle line, battle line, battle line, because the author wants us to connect these two stories. One is the contest between God, Yahweh, and Dagon, and now is a contest between Goliath and some unknown champion of Yahweh. The absence of that champion starts to grate on David, and so he finally takes it upon himself to step into the role of representing Yahweh in this contest between the Philistines and the Israelites. Initially, Saul tries to equip him like a soldier with armor and mail and swords and helmets, and David says, these are not tools that I use my shepherd's tools. And so he walks out onto the battlefield to face down this giant with a stick and a sling. It makes Goliath laugh. He asks the question, what am I, a dog that you've decided to come and attack me with a stick? And there's a subtle implication in the text there that David thinks, yeah, you are a dog. You are no better than a dog. So why stoop to your level and fight you on the ground of your choosing with swords and spears, when in reality this isn't a contest between you and me. This is a contest between the gods that we represent. And David says that. He says, I come at you in the name of Yahweh, the God of armies, the living God, whose battle lines you have insulted. You see, in that moment, David understands what's going on. And the author wants us to see that David sees this contest not as a contest between warriors, not as a contest between him and the Philistine giant, not even a contest between the armies of Israel and the armies of the Philistines. Instead, this is a contest between gods. And David is so confident in the power and strength of his God, Yahweh, that he goes out to battle with little more than a stick and a sling. Now, we know the story, right? David slings a stone. Goliath collapses on his face, just like the idol of Dagon did, before David. And David leaps on him, rips his sword out of its scabbard, and severs Goliath's head from his shoulders, just like Dagon had his head cut from his shoulders. And in that moment, the battle lines of the Philistines collapse, they run in terror, and the battle lines of Israel chase them down in victory. But the contest was decided long before the armies actually collided. The contest was decided on that moment when David said, I come as the avatar of Yahweh. I represent the God of Israel, the living God, the God of armies. And because we knew what happened in chapter 4 and 5 and 6, we expect, as good readers of the text, to see the same thing happen in chapter 17. When we learn to ask the question, what is the author doing with the text, we will often come away from stories that we are very, very familiar with a better understanding of what it is trying to say. In this case, the point of David and Goliath isn't, with God's help, you can fight the giants in your life. And it's not even that you're not David, but Jesus is David, and Jesus will fight the giants in your life. This story has nothing to do with that. Instead, because the author is connecting chapters 4 and chapter 17 together, he's saying that the contest between kings is not a contest between kings, it's a contest between gods. And only one God ever walks away from those battles, and it is the living God, Yahweh. The king is simply the tool through whom God protects and delivers his people. Ma'aracha, battle lines, is the word that changes how we read the story of David and Goliath.